Great. Thank you very, very much, Tom, for this great presentation. And I'm really chuffed to welcome Rachael Treharne to the stand. And Rachael will also tell us more about her research and about how she came to work in the field of the cryosphere. So Rachael, when you're ready, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
I don't need that quite as high. All right. Great. Yeah, well, it's great to talk to you all today. It's super exciting to be here and have to made it into the pavilion. My name's Rachael. I'm a researcher at Woodwell Climate Research Institute in Massachusetts. And similarly with our first presentation from Francois, I'd like to start us off with a picture. And this picture that you're looking at here, this is really just a teeny tiny little patch of the Arctic. And I'd like to kind of invite you to imagine that you're in this picture, maybe walking around in this environment. And if that was the case, you'd probably be sort of paying some attention to the trees you can see here, these kind of slightly scraggly looking spruce trees. Maybe you'd be looking at the this really thick layer of moss, which would be covering almost all of the ground surface. But you might not be thinking too much about what would be under your feet. But I think you can see really clearly from this picture that what is under the ground is actually a really huge and critical part of this ecosystem. And what it is that would be under your feet is firstly this kind of quite shallow layer of soil that is frozen solid in the winter but thaws during the summer. And then below that, this frozen layer, what we call the permafrost. So this is ground that stays frozen year on year. And it's this portion of the ground, the frozen ground, the permafrost, which I'd like to talk to you about for the next few minutes. And there's a lot of reasons to be interested in and to really care about permafrost. In my opinion, one of those is that it underlies some of the most fascinating and the most beautiful ecosystems that we have around the world. But another one is that it is an absolutely enormous carbon store. Across the Arctic, permafrost stores almost twice as much carbon as there is in the atmosphere today. That is more than twice as much carbon as is stored in all of the trees across the face of the planet. So this is a huge, critically important carbon reservoir. Unfortunately, as we all know, the Arctic is also warming, and it's warming really fast. So this graphics was created by my colleague, Greg Fisk, who you should follow on Twitter and Instagram. He does a lot of these fantastic graphics. And this is showing projected temperature change in the across the world by the middle of this century. And what it highlights really well is that really disproportionate rate of warming that we're seeing happening in the Arctic. And as the Arctic warms, of course, that means the ground also begins to warm, and that means that frozen ground begins to thaw. And that's exactly what you can see happening in this great video of these permafrost cores being thawed out in the lab. And this process of thaw, this is something that is already beginning to happen in parts of the Arctic. And it's something that, of course, is projected to get worse. So we're looking at seeing something like around a quarter to almost 3/4 of all of the near surface permafrost. So that's permafrost in the top 3 meters of the ground being lost this century. And where we fall within what, of course, is a really wide range there depends on how ambitious we are in our mitigation. And what this means is that as the ground thaws, the carbon that has been locked away in that kind of deep freeze of the permafrost, of course, then becomes vulnerable to decomposition. And ultimately, that means that carbon can then be released back into the atmosphere as CO2 or as methane. So the obvious question there for permafrost scientists is, how much of a problem is this? How much carbon do we expect to see being released in the permafrost? And when do we expect those emissions to happen? And in what form? How much CO2 and how much methane are we going to get from the permafrost? And I'm going to do the classic academic move here, I'm afraid, and say sort of before I get into answering this question, I'm going to talk about why it is so difficult to answer it and why we can't do that super well. The first reason for that is kind of quite intuitive, it's quite obvious. And that is that the Arctic is this enormous region. Much of it is sparsely occupied. It can be quite inaccessible. It's pretty hard to work there once you're out there. And it's also extremely variable. Large parts of the Arctic change a lot over a small spatial scale. So we have a pretty limited pool of data to work with, and it's really hard to use that data to generalize across the entire Arctic. So there's some real challenges there. But the second reason is what I'm kind of going to focus on from now on, and that is that we talk about permafrost thaw like it's one process, and actually this is quite a complex set of different processes. So when we talk about permafrost thaw, particularly actually when we're having sort of policy-related conversations, what we're actually talking about is gradual permafrost thaw. So this is where, as the air temperature rises, the ground temperature gradually rises from the top down, and we see the top of the permafrost gradually thawing, and therefore that kind of surface of the permafrost table just getting lower and deeper. And this is the dominant process by which permafrost is thawing. But it's something that also happens pretty slowly. It happens centimeter by centimeter and happens kind of on the scales of sort of years to decades. But permafrost can also thaw much more abruptly. What we sort of say, well, the term we use, abrupt thaw, this is actually kind of an umbrella term for a whole different collection of processes by which permafrost thaws abruptly. So exposing as much as meters of carbon quite rapidly over perhaps days or years. And this happens typically when we're looking at ice ground, which is quite ice-rich thawing. So as that ice is lost and melts, then we see this kind of uneven subsidence or complete collapse of the ground. And these are the kind of processes that you often see in these sort of quite dramatic pictures that are in articles about permafrost thaw, where you see these huge slump features or ground collapse features. The problem here is that because this is a large group of complex processes, not only do a very small minority of climate models include anything to do with permafrost carbon at all, but those that do only consider gradual permafrost thaw. So there are no climate models at the moment which consider the impact of abrupt permafrost thaw. We have a very similar issue when we look at fire. I'm sure all of us have heard a lot about increasing and more severe fire regimes happening in different parts of the Arctic, particularly over the last few years. We've seen some really extreme fire years. So fire is a really important part of these ecosystems. And as you can imagine, it also has really big impacts on permafrost. In the Arctic, fire, actually, most of the emissions from fire do come from below ground. So they come from the combustion of soil and organic matter in the ground. But following a fire, you've lost the vegetation, you've darkened the surface of the ground, and that means that you speed up gradual thaw, and you also make kind of the beginning or the acceleration of these abrupt thaw features more likely. So you have quite a strong impact on accelerating those processes as well. And again, fire, the combustion of below ground material and the emissions associated with that, and the impacts that fire has on both types of permafrost thaw, none of these things are currently included in any climate models. So some of the work we're doing at Woodwell is really focused on trying to change that. So my main research project at the moment is working with a reduced complexity Earth system model. So that's really just a sort of simplified climate model to try and build these underrepresented processes I've talked about into that model for the first time. So particularly focused on some of those abrupt thaw processes and on the impacts of fire. And I'm doing that through a combination of observational data sets that we do have and modeled relationships based on that data and on theoretical knowledge. And this is it's very much work in progress, so it's not peer reviewed, but I wanted to give you a flavor of how some of the outputs from this research are looking so far. And so to kind of start that off, what we're looking at here is an example of projections of future emissions from gradual thaw under a pretty moderate warming scenario, so under RCP 4.5. So this is just gradual thaw from about the present day out to the end of this century. And if we use our updated climate model to look at this same period of time and to look at the emissions from fire and from abrupt thaw and the impact of fire and permafrost, then we're looking at something like this. So you can see that these processes, which again are not included in any climate models, it's looking like these are a really substantial source of emissions. And just a note, I'd appreciate people not sharing this because, like I say, it's not peer reviewed. But again, to do this, looking at a more extreme warming scenario, so RCP 8.5, and we know that under this scenario, we expect to see much more widespread gradual thaw, but nonetheless, we're still looking at those underrepresented processes, so abrupt thaw and the impacts of fire are really still on the same scale as gradual thaw. And just for a little bit more context here, emissions from the EU in 2017 were around here, and from the US, they were around here on this graph on the right. So really, I think what this means is that if we kind of discount these emissions, if we're not conscious of this additional source of emissions, then we are really kind of ignoring something of the same magnitude as a large global economy when we're considering the necessity for mitigation effort. So yeah, what do we do with this information? What does this mean for COP? I mean, clearly, I think it means that when we think about policy tools like our carbon budgets that are informed by science, we have to recognize that these things are not a safety net. We know that there are a number of processes that are not included in climate models and therefore are not included in carbon budgets. And we have to recognize that those things nonetheless will have an impact on future climate. And we have to make our mitigation decisions accordingly. So I think really being here at COP, this really, of course, underscores the urgency of ambitious mitigation. And I think hopefully demonstrates the need for ambitious action and for compromise in terms of moving forward on some of those decisions we need to make. And yeah, that's it from me. I'm very happy to take questions either here or online. Thanks very much. Oh yes, does anybody have any questions? Happy to chat more. The question is it too late? Is it too late to save permafrost? And I mean, it's a great question. And really, I think, though, is it perhaps the wrong question? Of course, we know that permafrost is already being affected by climate change. We know communities located on permafrost are being hugely affected by climate change. So in a sense, we can't completely fix this problem. But I think really the question should be, you know, what is still at stake? And of course, a huge amount is still at stake. As I've mentioned, we're expecting to see somewhere between a quarter and up to 3/4 of near-surface permafrost lost this century. So that means there's a huge range there that we can prevent from happening. And that is something that has enormous impacts on the landscape across the north and, of course, on the communities that live there. So it is too late to save all the permafrost, but we can make it a lot worse if we are not ambitious now. Anybody else have any questions? Sure. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh. So the question is how much CO2 is already being emitted from this process, and so this is a really good question, and it's something that we talk about a lot as a community. So in the past, or sort of without the interference of humans, the Arctic has been as this kind of small, consistent carbon sink, so it's been taking up carbon on average. Of course, what this process means is that we expect the Arctic, as I've discussed, to become a substantial source of carbon emissions. But at the same time, we're also seeing other things happening. So we know that, for example, right now, like a lot of the Arctic is greening. So we see more vegetation, and that means more carbon uptake. So at the moment, we're kind of in that transition phase where we know that some parts of the Arctic are now a carbon source. But we don't know whether the Arctic as a whole has made that transition to being a carbon source. If it hasn't, it will do soon. But I think we are in that period of time where some parts are, some parts possibly haven't yet. So it's not clear. And again, as I said, it really highlights that need for more monitoring and more data because, for example, huge areas of the Arctic, like Siberia, we have no idea because there's no monitoring stations out there. So, yeah. Anybody else? Any questions or comments before we move on? Oh yeah. So on my Twitter, my name is just my Twitter account, so definitely on there. And actually, I've also provided a link on there too. We have just launched a data visualization and kind of narrative exploration site called Unstable Ground. It's unstableground.org. I would really encourage you to check it out. And that's also where we're going forwards. We'll be sharing lots of visualization and lots of information and narratives about our work across the Arctic. So, yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this great work and great presentation.